Mi può dire la strada per andare al convento dei Cappuccini?
Prendete questa strada a sinistra e arriverete ad un edificio lungo e basso, è il Lazzaretto. Costeggiatelo fino a Porta Orientale, dopo 400 passi troverete senz'altro il convento.
Renzo was probably coming from the village of Ponte Seveso and found himself on the spot where today Via Fabio Filzi crosses Via Marangoni. Following the direction of the gentleman, he arrived where today Via San Gregorio is and walked along the Lazzaretto until he reached the road of Loreto, now Corso Buenos Aires. Towards the end of Via San Gregorio, we can still admire what remains today of the ancient building, a segment of its perimeter about 20 meters long, which a few years ago became the see of the Russian Orthodox Church of St. Nicholas, and now welcomes many people every day. The Lazzaretto originally occupied a much larger area, the one today comprised between Via San Gregorio, Corso Buenos Aires, Viale Vittorio Veneto and Via Lazzaretto. The small church of San Carlo is at the center of this area. In the 15th century, during the Ambrosian Republic, people began to discuss the need to isolate the victims of the plague. The 24 captains of Milan entrusted the Ospedale Maggiore for providing shelters to the infected in the Castle of Cusago and in the surrounding forest. However, the inadequacy of these shelters and the supplications of the Milanese led the Pope to allocate land in the area of Crescenzago and to promise indulgence to those who would contribute to finance the construction. The notary Lazzaro Cairati presented a project that was never carried out due to the distance of the site from the city and to the costs for the completion. In 1486, Count Galeotto Bevilacqua bequeathed to the Ospedale Maggiore the sum of 6,000 ducats on condition that they be used to build a Lazaret on a plot of land contiguous to the church of San Gregorio outside Porta Orientale. The project of architect Lazzaro Palazzi envisaged a building along the perimeter of an almost perfect square, as its sides measured 370 meters by 378. It was surrounded by a moat fed by the water of the Redefossi canal. The moat prevented the sick from escaping, but also served to drain the waste waters. The main entrance was on the side facing the city, while the secondary entrance was on the opposite one, directly facing the cemetery of San Gregorio. In the Lazzaretto there were 288 rooms in total, reserved, depending on the sections of the building, to the sick or to the service staff. They had mostly a square ground plan, a surface of about 22 square meters. They were covered by a brick barrel vault and lit by a large window with bars overlooking the moat. A large fireplace provided heating, while in the thickness of the wall there was a latrine connected to the moat. At night, the door, equipped with a peephole, was closed from the outside to prevent the sick from escaping. On the inner sides of the building there was a large portico, supported by small columns with roughly shaped capitals. In the center of the square stood a church, which had been originally merely a dome on 4 columns. After the plague of 1576, by decision of the Archbishop Carlo Borromeo, the church was rebuilt in accordance to a project by architect Pellegrino Tibaldi. The church was open on all sides in order to allow the sick to follow the Mass from their rooms. After it remained abandoned for decades, it was restored and transformed when the Lazzaretto was eventually demolished. In the novel of Alessandro Manzoni, The Betrothed, Renzo arrived in Milan along the road of Loreto, today Corso Buenos Aires, which at the time was just a narrow road between two hedges outside of the city. As he arrived where today is Piazza Oberdan, Renzo passed the Porta Orientale, i.e. the eastern gate of the city, which consisted of two pillars covered by a shed and flanked by a small building housing the tax collectors. By looking to the right, one could then see the church of San Dionigi, as it had been rebuilt by Pellegrino Tibaldi in 1543. It had been already mutilated of the choir by Ferrante Gonzaga, who needed to make room for the construction of the city ramparts. The original church, built to house the remains of San Dionigi, dated back to the 5th century. It was probably rebuilt at the beginning of the 11th century by the bishop Ariberto d'Intignano, whilst the adjacent Benedictine monastery became a hospital for the poor. In this embossed copper cross, now visible in the Museum of the Duomo, Ariberto is portrayed as he offers to the Christ the church with its two bell towers. San Dionigi had probably 3 naves, 2 simple chapels at the sides, and a presbytery with an apse that rose on top of a crypt. It housed the marble sarcophagus of Valerio Petroniano, now in the Duomo. The church was ransacked by the Landsknechts in 1527, and in 1532 it passed from the Benedictines to the Servite friars. In 1543 the works for the new church began, while the old one was demolished to make room for the new city walls. Only the bell tower survived. In 1728 also the new church will be demolished in order to create the public gardens. Renzo approached the city from the Corso di Porta Orientale, today called Corso Venezia, alongside which ran a ditch. As he came to the crossroad with Via Borghetto, he saw a column with a cross at the top dedicated to San Dionigi. Renzo found there some bread, abandoned during the looting that was taking place in Milano. The spot mentioned in the Betrothed is marked by a plaque. After a few hundred meters, Renzo arrived at the monastery of the Capuchin friars. On the opposite side of a small square shaded by elms, he saw the church and the monastery, where he looked for Father Bonaventura. The church, built between 1593 and 1599, had a single nave with a choir and 2 chapels on each side. On the facade there was probably a fresco by Cerano. Today the Rocca Saporiti Palace stands in its place. In the inner gardens of the palace one can still get an idea of the peace and quiet of the ancient monastery. In 1805 the order was suppressed and, before being demolished around 1930 to form Piazza Duce and the surrounding streets, the building of the monastery will be used for various activities in an area known as El Calderón. But let's leave Renzo as he ventures into the city, and let's go back to the Lazzaretto. After the plague of 1630, the building was mainly used for military purposes, and in 1797 it hosted the celebrations of the Cisalpine Republic by the government installed by Napoleon. In 1812 it was returned to the Ospedale Maggiore, and over the years it offered lodging to the numerous immigrants arriving in Milan. New windows were opened and the rooms were divided with partitions. On the Corso Loreto, now Corso Buenos Aires, the ditches were covered and several shops were opened. In 1857, the project of the railways of Upper Italy was approved. It included a stretch of railway crossing the Lazzaretto on a viaduct, which divided the area in two. In 1881, the Ospedale Maggiore eventually sold the building to the Banca di Credito Italiano, which created a new district with a high population density and 6-floor residential buildings. The famous architect Luca Beltrami, in charge of studying the building before its demolition, strongly criticized this urban development initiative. The Lazzaretto, a bad memory for the city, was eventually demolished without much regret, except for the small stretch in via San Gregorio. Its entrance was rebuilt in Varedo in the Villa Bagatti Valsecchi.